in some ways, this particular chapter is more conducive for a story, you know, for if you had to explain to somebody what happened in this period in American history. Well, this is the American Revolution. It's a story. I mean, you talk about what happened with the British and the Americans and the battles and the kind of the backdrop to that, because there was stuff happening in America. So what my thought was is that if you had to tell the story of what happens in this chapter to somebody, what I would like you to do is take a couple minutes, get out a piece of paper and take a couple minutes to write down what would be the major events that you would cover in your story. Like if you wanted to be sure when you told somebody the story that you didn't forget anything. So you wrote yourself some, you know, little cheat notes. What would be in your story? And then after you have the events written down, try to put them in chronological order. I mean, not necessarily with exact dates, but to sort of get them in the general order in which they happened. Because it's another thing I find students don't do real well. Who needs paper to jot some of this stuff down?
Paper, and I also need pencil.
Something to write with? Is that often students miss cause and effect because they don't get the chronology right. If you understand that this event happened before this event, it might make more sense that that's why it happened, because if this had not happened, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. So just take a few minutes to jot down what events, I mean, you can look at your book, you can look at the notes, whatever, this isn't a test. What would be the major events that you would include? Now, let me also add something to that. If you had to tell the story in 5 minutes, what would you eliminate from your story because you don't have time to cover it and it really isn't as pertinent as maybe some of the other things? So write down, if you absolutely only had 5 minutes to tell the story of the Revolutionary War and the political events that were happening at the same time, what would be in your story?
Political events, what?
Well, like how the Americans were organizing themselves to be able to fight against the British, that type of political event. At first, it could just be stream of consciousness. Anything that you can think of that was in the chapter that you thought was important, just jot down those events. And then kind of go back and look at it and see if you can figure out how you would, you know, tell the story from beginning to end. Hey. All right, I just gave them, I asked them to do something in the next few minutes.
Okay.
And basically, if you had to tell the story of what you read in this chapter, and you only had 5 minutes to tell it, what would be the major events that you would cover? So I'm asking that you to jot down the major events in this chapter that you would cover to explain to somebody. And if you have to include something that happened before this chapter to, you know, to set the context, that's okay too. I mean, if you feel like you've got to give some context before you launch into the events of the actual chapter.
That's okay, I'm in the wrong book.
want to go to the very top?
Yeah.
Jennifer, what I asked him to do is if you had to tell the story of the American Revolution in 5 minutes, I want you to jot down the major events that you would cover. Because in 5 minutes, you can't tell the whole story. So what would be the ones you would feel like you had to share, and what would you skip over? Oh, scroll.
Yeah. Does dates get progressively later all the way to the bottom?
Not in the way these notes are set up.
Okay, we'll go down a little bit until I find the release note, release date.
Well, this is 1776 for the common sense.
Go up a little bit, go up a little bit. Go down all the way so I can see all the dates. Wish I could just have a paper. Is there a way I could just get a paper with that on it?
I don't have anything with me.
Down a little bit. I've been here for 5 minutes, go down. Go down some more. Down. Okay, more down. Down. Go down.
That's it.
At the end, okay, go back up to the top. I think I need to start this thing. Okay, that's probably enough.
Done?
Don't move. What are we supposed to do?
Well, this chapter was on the Revolutionary War, so there's a whole bunch of stuff in the chapter. And what I said at the beginning was, if you had to tell the story of the Revolutionary War in 5 minutes, what would be the major events that you would feel like you would have to include? And which ones would you leave out because you just don't have time to tell it in 5 minutes? Trying to get you to focus on like what's the most important things. All right, I know most of you probably aren't done, that's okay, that's not good. It's not important to necessarily go through the whole chapter. But how many of you started to write kind of a narrative,
Narrative, I haven't.
like sentences? How many of you started doing
Well,
that?
I've written some notes down.
Okay, how many of you just wrote like names of events?
Yeah,
Kind of like bullet, like you did more of an outline?
yeah.
It's just interesting to see the way people organize their thoughts when they do stuff. Not that there's a right or wrong, but kind of figuring out your own way of organizing material so as to study it and to master it is an important step in your own journey as a student. And people can suggest different things to you, but you still have to find what works best for you. Personally, I probably went overboard when I was a student doing things, but it worked for me. When I tell my students that you should study at least 10 hours for a midterm or a final, most of them fall off their chairs. To me, that's minimum that you study for a major exam. And if you come in and say, that test was too hard, I got a D on it, and I say, how many hours did you study? And you say, I studied at least 2 hours. I'm just going to laugh in your face. Because a midterm exam should be hard, it should be difficult, it should be comprehensive, and if you only study 2 hours for material that you've spent 8 weeks studying in class, that doesn't seem like enough to me. So this is just kind of an exercise in how to organize things in your own mind, but just so that you're aware for midterms, that's kind of my expectation. So what'd you come up with? What would be one of the first things that you would feel that you would need to share with somebody?
I would say my first note is disgruntled by British laws.
What's that?
Disgruntled by British laws.
Okay, so the British laws that had been passed up to this point, the taxes, some of the navigation laws and things like that, obviously had set the stage for the Americans to be upset. What else?
The second note is desire to expand westward.
Okay, so American desire to expand westward was also a part of this. And how did that affect their relationship with the British?
The British didn't want to go west.
Didn't want them to, right? That proclamation of 1763. So these things are coming into causing the British and the Americans to come into conflict.
But it really starts with when the Englishmen, they start getting into the colony. When they start to establish the colonies is when it's really start. Because with this one, didn't put any kind of flaw, anything like this. This is what we call the salutary neglect. This is where everything starts really.
Okay. Who else? Just throw something at me, I don't care.
Signing of the Declaration of Independence,
Okay. Where does that go?
below that.
Something else?
Continental Congress,
Where's that go?
above Declaration of Independence.
Which one, first or second?
Second. Well, first half first.
It's actually, both of them go
First and
before the
second.
Declaration of Independence, right? Because this one's in 1774 and this one's in 1775, so they're both before the Declaration of Independence, right? What else?
But then Washington was appointed to lead the troops in 1775, so to
So-
be between the two Congresses.
Right. Well, actually, at the second Congress is where they,
Yeah. Appointed him.
yeah. So this happens here. So they're creating an army now, right?
Correct.
What else?
Common sense,
Hmm?
Thomas Paine's Common Sense,
Where's that go?
Right, 1774.
right? Yeah, 75, I think. 76.
When 1776?
Early.
January, right? All right, what else?
We talked about the colonists and the loyalists probably at some point after that.
I'm gonna set that over here, just because it's. Shouldn't call that colonists. Should call it the Patriots. Not the football team. What else?
The story of Washington camping at Valley Forge during winter.
And what
is
winter is it?
1777.
Okay.
Battle of Bunker Hill, that's 75, I think.
Yeah, so where does that fit in all this?
Right after Washington appointed general in 1775.
Yeah, so what's wrong with that picture?
You could have a whole timeline of just 75 and 76.
This is June of 1775. Why does that seem a little off? What hadn't happened yet?
The Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, we haven't declared independence.
Yet, no.
So what is this when you have American colonists waging war against a British army?
Treason.
That's called treason. You get shot for that. Well, today I don't know what they do, but back then they shot you for that. So all of those people who participated in that battle and had anything to do with it were committing treason against the English government. And the English did not take treason lightly. It's pretty significant that this is the battle with the most casualties in the war, and it happens even before the Declaration has been declared, independence has been declared. Okay, what else? Who else has something on their list?
Enlighten idea of republicanism.
You're absolutely right, and that kind of goes, up here as far as the background. Republicanism is a whole story we could get into, but my question would be, remember, we're trying to tell this in 5 minutes. We're going to end up having to take some things out, and it'll be interesting to see what we think we have to take out. What else? Aaron, you got something for me?
Well, right after the Declaration of Independence, wasn't it the Revolutionary War started to form, like we started to decide, okay, this you have all those little battles, well, not little, but you have like a couple, battles, but in a 5-minute segment. I mean, how are you gonna talk about every single one of them?
Exactly. So, generally speaking, when I teach this, I focus on what I think are the most important American victories. So if we had to focus on the most important American victories in the Revolutionary War, this is not one of them. Now, this is one of the things I cover, the Valley Forge. So that's not a victory, but to me it's a very significant thing that happens in the war. It says something, it's a victory in the sense of the victory of the American spirit. It's not a victory in the sense of a battle. But I think this is a huge turning point in the war. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But what are some of the American victories that were significant in terms of keeping us going?
I would say the French intervention, them financing the war, we wouldn't have been able to do
Right,
it.
and when did the French do that?
That was Saratoga.
Saratoga, which is what year? Is it before or after Valley Forge?
Staff.
77.
It's actually the winter, it's the fall just before Valley Forge. It's October of '77, okay? This victory, where we captured a 5,000-man British army, was what led the French to decide to ally with us, openly ally with us. They were helping us already. Because nobody wants to come in on a losing side. If you think they're going to get their butts kicked, why are you going to join with them? Because then when you all lose, you're going to probably lose too, right? You're going to probably have to give something up. They didn't want to come in unless they thought the Americans actually had a chance. And this victory made them think, okay, with our help, they might be able to do this. So that's really significant. What about before Saratoga?
Before you do the battles, you have to do the Articles of Confederation, because didn't that kind of help get everything going,
Yeah,
as far
but
as organization?
sort of. That's kind of, remember, they're not actually ratified till 1778, even though they were being written kind of in this whole period. And you're absolutely correct, this is significant, but it's not totally significant because I don't know that the states looked at the articles as much as we do today. They didn't put a whole lot of credence in this national government that they were creating, but we'll get back to that. But militarily, let's kind of stay on one topic here. What else happened in here?
Trenton.
Trenton and Princeton. Again, this may have actually saved the war. Minor victories. We ended up losing Trenton and Princeton again shortly thereafter. But the fact that Washington was able to outsmart the British and the British mercenaries by crossing back over the Delaware, attacking those two places, and actually having a victory, outsmarting them because back in this time period, you didn't fight in the winter. Everybody just said, see you guys, we'll come back, bring your guns in the spring, when things thaw, we'll start shooting each other then. But for now, we're all going to just take a break. So for Washington to do what he did completely took them by surprise. Bringing his army back out in winter, crossing the Delaware River and attacking them. Again, small victories, but the victory was more morale because Washington was about to lose his army. His men were tired, they didn't think they could win this war. The enthusiasm had waned. It was like, we're up against the British Army and Navy, there's no way we can do this. So, if any of you have ever played sports, you can have a losing season, and if you come out and have that one victory, it can change everything. And so this is really significant in terms of Washington even being able to keep his army together over that winter and be able to put them back out there in 1777 in the spring. If he hadn't had this, most of those men probably would have deserted. So to me, that's extremely significant. What other military victory is significant for the Americans? I mean, there's many, but to me, there's certain ones that are kind of the major, either turning points or that last nail in the coffin kind of thing. What's the last major victory that the Americans had? was in 1781, I believe. Now, obviously, there's lots of other stuff going on in there, but this is a victory where the Americans, the British had to surrender 7,000 man army to them, and from that point on, the British began to talk about some type of ceasefire, some kind of peace treaty. Even though the war goes on for a couple more years, it's pretty much winding down, and the British are not willing to put forth the effort to actually defeat the Americans. So to me, and again, I know another teacher could stand here and say, oh, but you got to talk about this battle, you got to talk about this battle. But to me, these are the major ones that at any of these points, if America had lost or given up, it would have been over. Valley Forge was just more of a matter of making it through that winter and being willing to come back out again. Because this one was where the people of America did not show their support. They sold their food to the British instead of the Americans, who were literally starving to death in camp that winter. Washington lost 25% of his men that winter. But at the same time, men are literally starving to death. He brings in a Prussian general. Now, back in that time period, the Prussians were the leading military men in the world. They had a huge army back at this time period, and nobody went up against them on land. They didn't have a navy, but on land, you didn't go up against the Prussians. He brings in a Prussian general to train his men. And they spent the winter at Valley Forge training. And the British, in the spring of 1778, felt like they were looking at a completely different force. I mean, because our Americans were not disciplined soldiers. This was not a regular army. I mean, he gathered people to just, hey, come on, we need you in the Continental Army. But there was no real sense of a structure and hierarchy and people obeying orders and any of that kind of stuff. The men chose their own commanding officers. So you chose who was going to be the easiest on you. And then this guy, Van Steuben, comes in and says, no, that's not the way we do things in the Army. And he whipped these guys into shape. So when they came back out after Valley Forge, they were a much more disciplined fighting force.
Yeah.
So we didn't spend Valley Forge sitting on our thumbs, feeling sorry for ourselves. Washington used it to get his men ready. And that, to me, is a huge turning point, especially when the people around you and the neighboring farms around you, your men are starving to death, and they won't even give you food because they're selling it to the British for British sterling. I mean, why wouldn't you as a soldier just say, well, screw this? Why am I here? You're not, I'm supposedly fighting for you, and you're not even supporting me. And yet, the fact that Washington could hold them together through that winter, I mean, they ate their horses that died because they couldn't feed the horses. I mean, they need food. So as the horses died, they ate the horses, which didn't have much left on them because they hadn't fed them for so long. That's how they got through that winter. So I think, probably most of us in America really don't know much about George Washington. I mean, we just know he was the first president, right? And he was tall. It's like all we know about it. But they say he wasn't nearly as brilliant as some of our other presidents. We've had some really smart presidents. But in terms of getting the job done and being able to just hold people's loyalty and just command their sense of, I want to follow you. I don't know that there's anybody else we've had in history that had that type of charisma. So anyway, Valley Forge. And then, as I've already said, Yorktown's kind of the nail that, last nail in the coffin, because Britain loses a 7,000 man army, and they're just like, you know what, we could beat these guys, but it would mean sending so many more soldiers over there, and it would cost so much money, and they're such a pain in the butt anyway, why do we even want to bother? So they just started to say, you know what, let's just let it go.
I wonder, did any of the British soldiers, after everything was over and Ireland and Britain said, let them have it, did they choose to stay? I wonder about that.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It wouldn't surprise me if some of them didn't, but at the same time, the Americans wouldn't have liked you a whole lot. So it might have been hard to fit in if they really knew you had actually been fighting against them, because there was definitely a lot of
Hey, I killed your
animals.
neighbor, can I say?
All right, what else would you include in your discussion?
Treaty of Paris.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, that's kind of the next thing, right? And that's 1783. What else?
The ceding of all the extra lands to Britain's empire.
Well, let's just leave it at the Treaty of Paris and how everything was divided out after the war was over with.
I know how.
Where all the territories went.
Okay, how about all the, thinking of a new government, how the new government was gonna work?
Okay, that's key to a lot of this, right? Because while the, you know, as Sean said before and as Rachel just said, is the government, is the American people, and when I say the American people, remember, it's not everybody. Many of them are not in favor of the war, but the ones who are have to figure out a way to organize so that they can fight this. They need soldiers, they need equipment, they need clothing, organization, they need authority to be able to do it, so they determined that they had to come up with some national type of organization. They can't just be 13 individual colonies trying to fight this war.
Yeah.
So they created this thing called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, the best way to define it is that it really is our first constitution as Americans.
Yeah.
So this is a constitution. It is a form of government that we are to live under. And when they created it, and it was ratified in 1778, at the time, that was our government. There wasn't any sense that 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road, we're going to change it. This is what they came up with. On top of that, each colony wrote their own individual constitution. And they began to call themselves states instead of colonies. So now we have 13 states that have their own individual constitutions, and they wrote those originally in the 1770s. And also in the 1770s, you've got the Articles. Now, in these state constitutions, I don't know if you remember what you read about this, but what's the main characteristic in terms of who's going to hold the power in the individual state?
New governor?
That's actually a good guess. It's not correct, though. Why would they not want to give the majority of the power to the governor?
Probably because he was just one person.
Yeah, and why would they have a problem with that?
No checks and balances.
They just got out from under a king, so they wanted to have.
Right,
a
so
Yeah.
there is a governor in these states, you know, they all have governors, and they all have what else?
Have a congress.
Legislature, let's call it that, just so we don't. Now, what they did in the 1770s is who did they give the power to?
The legislature.
They wanted the legislature to have the power, because to them, the power would come from the people that way, not from one person acting like a king. The interesting thing is, in the 1780s, almost every one of these states revised their constitutions. And what did they do in those revisions?
Switch the power.
They said, oh, maybe we don't want the legislature to have that much power. Maybe the governor really does need to have more power. Americans began in the 1780s to have a fear as what was often referred to as mobocracy. The people, it's one thing to have the smart people, the powerful people, the rich people in charge, but when you just have everybody in charge, people don't necessarily want that. I don't know if any of you have ever served on a jury.
Well, I almost did once, but they didn't never pick us to go in, so all we did was sit in the front.
And many of us have had that experience of having to go, but then not being called. Have any of you ever actually been on a jury? Okay, I've been on one. Scariest thing I've ever experienced. because I looked around that room of my fellow jury members and I thought, oh my God, if I ever am in the position of the accused, how scary to have my life in their hands. I don't necessarily want my peers judging me on a jury, because
You get that mob rule thing going, where if you can get one person that can rile everybody else up, everybody starts like going in that direction, whether they believe it or not, because they just get hyped up and
right,
excited.
and I definitely had that experience on mine. And then you have people that just,
Are stupid.
they're just not real rational or bright, and you're like, you're gonna decide I mean, I really wasn't the one on trial. But I just thought, I don't know if this is really the best system. I mean, I understand why we do it, and I understand democracy and all that kind of stuff, but that's kind of scary to be at. Anyway, same thing here, because they said, oh yeah, it'd be great, the people will be involved, we're gonna be different than the monarchies of Europe and everything, and they tried it for a few years, and then they were like, we don't like this. We don't like having just the average person being able to have decision-making power, because they don't have the education, they don't have the experience, or they don't have anything at stake. The average person may not have land or money or anything, and so what they decide could end up being horrible, but they're not really going to lose anything because they don't have anything invested. So they began to change this. What kind of national government did we create with the Articles of Confederation?
Let me think. The Republican one, sorta.
It's definitely Republican. Is it a powerful central government?
No.
I think it was supposed to be central government and powerful people.
Yeah, they wanted a very weak central government, because who did they want to have the power?
States.
The states. Now, the states wanted to have the power, but as I said, they started out giving more power to the people and then turning around and saying, wait a minute, maybe we need to keep the power in fewer hands to make sure that things are handled the way that they should be. Well, we kind of did the same thing here. We're going to get into this more next week, but the Articles of Confederation were only in existence for about 10 years. We replaced it with what?
The Constitution.
The U.S. Constitution, right, in 1789. So, 11 years the Articles are in existence. How long has the U.S. Constitution been in existence? I don't need an exact date. 200 and some years. Pretty different. That's a pretty major difference, right? One of the major problems with this, and it talks about this in your notes and everything, and I wish we had more time to get into it, but we created such a weak national government, they really didn't have the power to do anything. I shouldn't say anything, but not much of anything. And they definitely couldn't tax, which we might say, whoa, great, we don't need to have taxes, but with no taxes, they can't have money to do the things they need to do, and in this case, they needed to fight a war. So it made it very difficult for them to carry out what they needed to do. But eventually, just within 11 years, we went from saying this is too weak, we haven't created a national government that can stand up to any kind of pressures, so we ended up revising it, and like I said, we'll talk about that next week, but we ended up creating the U.S. Constitution. Again, it amazes me that the U.S. Constitution has stood as long as it has, because it was written by people over 200 years ago that had no idea what life would be like today. So obviously, it's a very flexible document that can be molded to fit the circumstances of our day. And when we have had to change it, how do we change it?
Amendment.
We make amendments to it, right? And how many amendments have we had to make to the U.S. Constitution in over 200 years? I was just going to say, I'm forgetting the exact number. I think it's 27 now. 27, that's it, in over 200 years. And when did we do the first 10?
Pretty much immediately.
In the first 2 years, right? Because the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments, and we had those by 1791. So since 1791, we've only amended the Constitution 17 times.
And one of those was getting rid of the previous one that we done, so.
Yeah. So it's pretty amazing that this thing has stood the test of time. All right, so this kind of piece is sort of happening alongside of this stuff, and it's going through. I mean, they're really having to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and a lot of it's not working through the 1770s and as we start into the 1780s, or at least not working as well as they want it to. So that's why they keep revising it, both the Articles of Confederation and the state constitutions. All right, what else would you include in your discussion?
Shouldn't like really small blurb, like off to the side, be like starting to abolish slavery in some states, like women's rights?
Well, yeah, because it's interesting that this is supposedly a fight for liberty, right? And yet, there's all of these other things where we're not extending the liberty to all people. So that's definitely a dichotomy, I would say. And then you've got the Indians too and how they're being treated, right? So you've got all these groups of people that are not really getting the benefit of that sense of, you know, we're fighting for liberty, but not for you guys. Only for certain people. All right, what else?
Shays Rebellion.
And why does Shays Rebellion happen? What's okay.
The farmers, right? Didn't like that their farms got foreclosed.
And why is their farms being foreclosed on? So there's a general economic stagnation after the war. I mean, we have some serious economic problems that set in after the war. Inflation is unbelievable. There's not enough hard money out there. Printed paper money isn't really worth anything. And because of those economic problems, farmers can't make a living, and their farms are being foreclosed on, and they're being taxed on top of it because the government's trying to bring in more money, so they keep taxing the people who don't have any money to begin with. So Shays Rebellion takes place. And it's interesting that one of the reasons, probably the main reason why this takes place is because of taxes. Taxes that the new American government is imposing on farmers. Why is that ironic?
The same reason we rebelled in the first place.
And how did we as Americans react to Shays Rebellion? What did the government do?
They wanted a stronger national government.
Or what did they do with Shays and his men?
They sent them to jail.
Yeah.
It's treason.
Yeah, it's like you're committing treason too. They arrested them, they put them in jail. Some of them were actually supposed to die. I don't know if any of them were actually hanged or if they let them all off, but some of them were sentenced to death for doing the exact same thing that the Americans had done against Great Britain. How soon we forget, right? So they're saying this new government is tyrannical. It's doing exactly what the king was doing to us. We've just traded one despot for another. But it also made the national government realize we don't have a strong enough national government because there was nothing that the national government really couldn't do anything about this. They didn't have the ability, the authority to send troops there. They had to rely on the state militias to do stuff like that. And Washington kind of freaked out. He's like, well, this is dumb. We can't do things this way. We have to have a stronger national government. And other people started to make that call as well. Because the national government can't just be, you know, at the mercy of whatever group of people decide that they want to riot and do something that they don't like. Now, obviously, we've struggled with this in our country from the very beginning. You have the right to speak your mind, right? You have the right to say how you feel as an American, even against your president. But at what point does that right begin to become treason? Probably shouldn't bring this up, but I will. Somebody posted on Facebook the other day, and I have a Facebook account, and I still can't, I don't know how to use it. I can't figure out anything on there. I only have it for people pushed me to have it, but I don't know how to do anything on it. Every time I open it, I get frustrated and close it. So every now and then I see something, but I don't know how to do anything with it. So somebody posted something, I happened to see it, and it was a picture of a bumper sticker that said, Obama sucks. And they were saying, you know, I agree 100% or something like that. Well, personally, I take offense at that. And it isn't about Obama. I think Bush was one of the worst presidents we've ever had. But I wouldn't put a bumper sticker on my car that says Bush sucks. Because he's the president of the United States. He's my president. Plus, if that's the most intelligent thing I can say about his programs, I should shut up. What kind of response is that? You disagree with the president and all you can say is Obama sucks.
Well, not only that, did you don't even understand government at that point?
Well, that's kind of my point. What if you did completely understand? What if you had a fully reasoned argument against why you don't like Obama's programs? That's not the way to communicate it. That doesn't show a heck of a lot of intelligence or thought on your part if that's all you can do. And I realize bumper stickers are small. You can't put a treatise on a bumper sticker. But you could probably come up with something more intelligent than that.
A way to show incentives changed.
Yeah. Now, but that person, I'll let you finish a second. That person has an American right to express themselves that way, right? I have the right to say that you might figure out a more productive way to express yourself. Well, let her say what she's going to, then I'll get to you.
I think the one thing that's happened, and I can say this only, I don't know if I've saying this beforehand, I can say this only because I did not grow up here. I grew up in Germany for first 14 years, so a different mindset. But I think for America, what I've seen in the 25 years that I've been here is they've become way more vocal about their presidents and their leaders in their country and how they stink and this, that, and the other. But looking at it from a different perspective, me being a German citizen, what I see is their own people kind of imploding their own government, because what does it look like for the Americans to complain about a government that they elected by the majority? What does it look like to outsiders? And I think that's very important to remember. And I think that with, just like you said, Obama sucks, or people that say things like that, what they're doing is they're really weakening America, because other countries are taking advantage of that. They find that little wormhole where they can get in.
Yeah. And I said almost that exact same thing to somebody after I had seen that. I said, what does that have to look like to the rest of the world? I mean, we can't even stand our own people. So, of course, it gives them the opportunity to use that against us.
And I'm going to tell you like this, it's a major factor of why I have not gotten my American citizenship. I am still to this day a German citizen.
That's interesting.
Even though I speak English and am more acclimated to America, I will not give up my German citizenship because it did change my mind.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
I was just saying, I hope whoever posted that would never be a jury like yours.
Me too.
I have a
Well,
feeling
and
that those
again-
jurors are those kind of people.
You know, I completely believe that a person has the right to disagree with our president and to not like, you know, his or her programs or whatever. I just think there's a much more constructive way to express yourself than to ride around in a car
You
that
also
says,
need more respect, for that. This is your president anyway.
yeah,
This
because
is
to
your
me,
country, yeah, respect it.
you know, but our system is so great because if we do disagree with our elected officials, we have the opportunity 2 years down the road or 4 years down the road to elect somebody else that we think might be able to do a better job. And that's the way that we can express ourselves. But to show that kind of disrespect to our president, I think does communicate to the rest of the world something that I personally don't want to have communicated to the rest of the world.
You know what I wonder? I wonder if that person with that bumper sticker gets food stamps or Medicaid or anything like that. Just saying.
Yeah, I know. And it just, like I said, Bush was not one of my favorite presidents. The first Bush I liked better, but the second Bush, not one of my favorite presidents. But I still wouldn't treat him like that.
Well, it kind of goes all back to like the Dixie Chick thing. It's like, okay, you have a right to voice your opinion. There's a way to voice it. And, it's not just about supporting your government. It's about supporting your neighbor that supports your government. It's about like the community, the people of the United States, your armed forces, whether they agree with the war or not. Like, there's people that defend us, and if you are that angry or disagree so much, then you go about it like you write your congressman and you vote and you
Right.
make sure your voice is heard that way. You don't, do that. That's just ignorance.
I think people would rather be loud than be intelligent a lot of times.
I was downtown Orlando, not the past weekend, the weekend before, like, on a Saturday night, whatever. And I never realized how much freedom of speech really meant in this country. I'm not kidding you, there was 4 loudspeakers on the corner of Magolian, I think that's called, with about 5, 6 protesters about abortions with microphones. And not once did they get kicked off, not once did anybody bother them. I mean, the cops were standing around them just in case anything happened, but I really did not realize how much you really have this freedom of speech. For them to be able to bring out speakers and sit there and voice their opinion. Well, I was just offended. It's like, really, it's Saturday night downtown. Why are you harassing everybody? But it's crazy how you are really able to do that.
Yeah,
And I'm like, why aren't the cops aren't even bothering them? The cops are sitting right next to them.
Because they probably had a permit to protest.
but even with that, again, you gotta,
It's crazy.
I would, again, it doesn't matter what their opinion is, but I would really question, is that the best way
Oh,
to get your message across? Because are you,
That just makes people mad.
You're
yeah,
not educated. So I swear when I was leaving,
Right.
leaving
You're
the
just
place I was
educated.
at, there was
Propaganda.
some person up there doing it. Like, I swear the girl was wasted.
I don't know, I think you can be more effective doing things in a different way
Yeah,
rather than
that's-
in somebody's face and being that,
Obnoxious.
yeah, obnoxious is probably
See,
a
and
good
I
word
was
for it.
raised Catholic, my parents are really Catholic, I went to Catholic school, and my mom always says, like, and she said it growing up, like, just because it's your belief doesn't mean it's a belief of everybody, and you don't always know the circumstance of everybody that goes in there. Like, you don't know if the mother has to, really wants the child, but it's literally, she has 3 children at home, and she has a congenital heart condition that they just found, and it's gonna be her or the child.
Right, exactly.
And she used to say to us all the time, don't shove the dove. Like, you just don't push your beliefs. Like, whatever your political or religious beliefs are, you just don't do that.
Well, and I think you make more of an impact just by living, out your beliefs and your values. I mean, you may not impact 1,000 people because you don't have a microphone down in downtown
I was
Orlando,
just
but
like,
you impact your circle,
For life.
and then your circle impacts circles, and that's, I don't know, that's
I think
the
people
way.
see things like the Westboro Baptist Church and they see how just,
Don't even get me started on
just
them.
insane
those
they
people
are
are
and how much
morons.
press they get all over. I mean, and that church is like 30 people in that church. It's tiny. In the middle of nowhere, Kansas, I think it's middle of
That's what
nowhere.
it is, yeah.
Those people are
Pure hatred.
everywhere,
Those
man.
people are pure hatred. Westboro County.
You know, they were supposed to come down for
Hey,
a
what?
protest my son's friend's brother's funeral, and me and my son started that whole thing about we're gonna demonstrate and make sure that they ended up not showing
What
up.
do you mean demonstrate? Protest?
They-
My
protest
son's friend,
everything.
his brother was in Iraq and he got killed in Iraq.
Funeral?
And
Yeah, that's what they do.
protested American soldiers' funeral, and they were supposed to come here to Palm Bay on Malibu Road.
Yes.
The
And
big
me and
thing
my
is
son,
that-
me and both
Yeah.
my boys were the first ones to start up, and we had this whole campaign going. And there was no way we were gonna let that happen.
That's
There was
bullshit.
just no way. And they
Their
ended up
big
not
general
coming.
thing is that bad things happen in the world because
I
the
don't
United
even
States
wanna
lets
get
gay
started
people
on
have
them.
rights.
It's so ridiculous.
No, they let gay people have rights so the United States has tragedies happen, like soldiers die in war because gay people
Times have changed.
have rights. It gets crazy.
2013. So ridiculous.
Well,
They're a special kind of nutbag.
That's 50 Shades of Crazy right there.
I'll just say this, and then we'll get back to the American Revolution. But I grew up extremely religious, and I'm still a religious person. I'm not a religious person. I don't do church anymore, but I definitely believe in God, and I have very strong beliefs, but spiritual. My big thing is God can take care of himself.
Yeah.
You know, he really doesn't need us to do, what he needs us to do is live our life here and to be the person he's called us to be. He has not called upon us to do all the stuff. I haven't found it. I have a degree in New Testament. I think I've studied it a little more than some people. I haven't found my walking orders to do that. I found my walking orders to live my life here. and to try to be an example by the way I live my life. And these people who do all this crazy stuff, it's just like, really? That just, to me, that's like, you're minimizing God. You're diminishing him because you don't think
He
he's
would never
big
stand in a
enough.
corner in downtown and say that.
But let me tell you now, Westboro Baptist did take it to the United States
I
Supreme
know.
Court, and they were found that they had a right to do what they did under the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's.
Which is
And
again
it's
kind of cool.
That is the
Crazy.
point of the
It's
Constitution.
kind of cool, right? That
Yeah,
we,
That,
You get to go to
my
bed.
mind was
Yeah.
really open. I was like, wow, you know,
Yeah.
you really do have freedom to speak.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
all right, just to kind of pull together some of the stuff that we've been talking about. I was kind of trying to do this for myself today. Like if I had to really tell the story very quickly, how would I do it? And we didn't get into a lot of stuff. I mean, you guys summarized here that there were these issues with the British that started back really in the 1760s, but definitely heated up in the 1770s. The taxes, the different laws, the way that Britain handled it, the fact that they wouldn't give them representation in Parliament, all of that stuff was leading up to them feeling that they had to take some kind of a stand. As they were starting to move in that direction, they started to feel that they better begin to prepare themselves. So we didn't talk about Lexington and Concord, but that's where the Americans had begun to gather some ammunition and guns and things like that in case it did turn into more of a physical type of a war. And the British found out about that and decided to send troops to collect those things. And that's when we have the first shots of the American Revolution, were at Lexington and Concord. When people refer to the shot that was heard around the world, they're talking about those first shots that took place at Lexington. Again, that's before the Declaration of Independence. We're still trying to make peace with the British. Even to the point that after the First Continental Congress, the Americans sent actually after the Second Continental Congress, which was in 1775, they sent the olive branch petition to the king saying, look, you know what an olive branch represents, right? Peace. You know, and they're saying, hey, we don't want to fight. We just, you know, we can work this out. We're loyal to you. We just need you to work with us on some of these other issues. But by then it was too late because you'd already had Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, and the king's like, no, you're treason. You're traitors. You've committed treason against the king. So now we're kind of at the point where it's sort of no turning back. Now, if the Americans at that point had really just said, okay, just do whatever you want, we'll give in, we don't want to fight, then maybe things would have stopped right there. But by that point, the Americans had decided that they couldn't do that. One of the real turning points, though, as far as getting some people off the fence and kind of pushing them toward that decision to declare independence is this guy here that wrote the pamphlet Common Sense. And when you talk about political propaganda, there's probably not a piece of political propaganda that's been written in history that was any more important than this one. Now, when we say the word propaganda, that often sounds bad. Like propaganda is not truth, it's not real. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
It's just hype, really.
Yeah, but it can be, there could be a tremendous amount of truth in it. It can just be said in such a way that stirs people. And I think a lot of what Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense was truth, but it was said in a certain kind of way to really sway people against the king. Now, most people had been directing their animosity toward Parliament, mostly because if you direct animosity toward the king, they usually kill you, so they tend to be more careful about that. But I do think that the English people, even to this day, still have something about their monarch. And the idea of speaking out against their monarch does not come easily for them. To speak out against Parliament is a different story. They're just, people. They're not the king. So they could do that more easily, but to actually come out against the king is not something that's easy for them to do. And Thomas Paine does that in his booklet. He basically says, guys, come on. Let's get real here. You know where the real problem is. First of all, the guy, King George is crazy. And he's not a good king, and he's treated you horribly. Why are you being nice to him and directing all your anger just at Parliament? It's really the whole system, and he happens to represent the whole system. And this particular pamphlet is like a bestseller in that time period, meaning, in terms of the number of copies it sold. And even if you didn't buy a copy, you heard about it in the taverns, on the streets. Everybody's talking about this. And it really does begin to force people to say, you know what, this guy's right. We've been messing with this for years now, nothing's changing. Now we're being called traitors by the king, when all we're trying to do is get what we believe are our rights. So it's time. And so the Declaration of Independence is finally written. We don't have the time today, but you know, I'm going to take the time. If you have your book, open it to the back of the book where the Declaration of Independence is, because I feel that. When's the last time you read the Declaration of Independence?
I was reading the original.
25 years
A
ago?
long time ago, probably. I never read the whole thing. The last time I wrote anything was probably in high school.
Well, that's what I started to say was that's just it. An awful lot of times, people really have never read the Declaration of Independence in full. We're aware of parts of it, right? And we're not going to read the whole thing right now. Don't freak out. Most of us have heard the first paragraph, right?
Do you know what page it's on?
Oh, it's A5 in the back of your book, in the appendix. A5 in the back of your book is the actual document, the Declaration. You guys are looking into where it talks about it. But go to the very back of the book. Oh, you're on the right page. I'm sorry. I saw the map and I didn't realize there was a map. So A5. The very first paragraph, I think, we're somewhat familiar with. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. And then I think most of us are definitely familiar with this paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. So that's the claim that the American founding fathers are making, that Britain has pushed things too far. It's gotten to the point where we now have the right to make this change. Now, they're pulling this part in here, talking about deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Where's that coming from? Whose philosophy is that coming from?
Locke.
John Locke. John Locke was an Englishman who wrote about government and the best forms of government and things like that. And it's referred to as the social contract. He talked about there's a social contract between the people and their government. And the only reason why the government's in place is because the people have consented for them to govern them. We recognize that we need some kind of organizational structure and that we have to submit some of our freedoms to that government. And so John Locke wrote about that, and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, stole it. He plagiarized. No, I'm just kidding. But he used the language of John Locke. The interesting thing is John Locke's been dead since 1704. He'd been gone for 70 years before we even get to this point, but his ideas live on. And it's his ideas that the American founders found to be so moving that they said, this is the kind of government we want. And so it's John Locke kind of sprinkled through the Declaration of Independence in terms of his basic ideas. But the part about the Declaration of Independence that most of us don't know is if you look at the Declaration, most of the paragraphs start with what word? He. Who's he?
The white man.
Now it's a specific he.
King George.
King George. This whole thing basically is they're coming out, they're attacking the king. They're not attacking Parliament anymore. Parliament's in here too, but most of it is directed right at the king. It's because of what the king has done that we must do this. I mean, the people who signed this, you talk about guts. They put their name to this, and they didn't sign it, you know, Donald Duck. They signed their real name. I mean, they went on the most wanted list, I can tell you. I mean, this is courage for these men to put their name to this and say, yes, and 56 of them did. Now remember, there's a whole lot more than 56 who fought this war, but 56 of them put their name to this document. And they declared to each other their loyalty and their commitment to the death to be able to achieve this goal. Now, I think many of them probably questioned that over the next few years because things didn't go well in the beginning. It was rough. And until the French really got involved, I don't know that many of them believed it was going to work. But convincing the French was huge, as we've talked already. So the Declaration of Independence, and again, if we had more time, I would talk more about this, but there was a whole paragraph in here about abolishing slavery. And it got struck. Why?
Because it couldn't be agreed upon.
Because we had a whole lot of slave owners in that room that said, nah, we don't want that in that Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, but we don't want to give up our slaves. So there is kind of that. If you ever get to go to Washington, D.C., go to the Library of Congress, the original copy of the Declaration of Independence is under glass there. And when I say original, I mean the original before they took out the paragraph about slavery. The actual document that Jefferson wrote on, and if you see that, it was, I'm weird, I know, but it was the coolest thing. I mean, I was like, this is the actual piece of paper that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And the paragraph about slavery is there, and it just has lines through it. Just like you would do if you're writing a paper and you're like, oh, I'm going to cut that out and change it to this. It has lines through it, and in the margin it says omit.
It's a pretty big thing to just allow out.
Yeah. I know, it was just like, I don't know, I stood there with, I mean, I'm feeling it now, like those goosebumps that come over you, I was just like, wow. I mean, what a moment in history, you know, first of all, that he wrote it. I mean, he was a slave owner and he wrote it. And then he comes back into the room the next day and says, okay, this is what I've come up with, and they're like, nah, don't like that, get rid of that, no, I'll change that. And you can see other changes that they made, but that's like a pretty major one, and it just has those lines through it. It's kind of chilling, you know? Anyway, so Declaration happens, then they begin to have, you know, the various battles. Obviously, they didn't know what was happening. We look at it from this point. We know that things worked out well for the Americans eventually. Treaty of Paris, an interesting thing happens. Remember, they're allies with the French, right? But when it came time to actually negotiate the settlement, the French are supposed to be there with them. Because the French want to make sure they get something out of this deal. We came to your aid, we've given you all this money, we've lost soldiers and all this other stuff, so we want to make sure we sit down at the table and we can get the British to give us something too. Well, it didn't work that way. Americans began to get nervous because the French weren't willing to negotiate yet. We wanted to get this war over with, so we ended up negotiating our own treaty with them without the French. And then the French find out about it, realize that now the British can take their attention away from the Americans and focus it on them. So maybe it's not in their best interest to continue. So they end up negotiating a treaty, and then the Spanish end up negotiating a treaty. And of course, we come out of that with the French not very happy with us, because we really kind of stabbed them in the back. They came in to help us, and then we sort of pushed them off to get what we needed. And the French are not going to be very happy with us, which is going to create a whole bunch of other things that are going to happen in the next, like, 20 years with the French after this particular event. But in terms of boundaries and stuff like that, the Treaty of Paris, it's in your notes, and you can see the maps in your book. We end up pretty much getting what we want. We pretty much get North America, at least to the Mississippi. Still going to have to deal with French territories, Spanish territories, those kinds of things. But in terms of the British, we pretty much get all of North America to the Mississippi and then up to Canada. One of the interesting things in all of this, we attacked Canada in the winter. Did we learn nothing from Napoleon? Oh no, Napoleon hadn't happened yet, had he? Did Napoleon learn nothing from us, right? You don't attack Russia or Canada in the winter. Dumb.
We got cocky with that all across the middle.
Yeah, I've always said, and there's no men sitting real close to me, if women had been in charge of the war, would not have happened. We would not have attacked Canada in the winter. We would have waited till the summer. But we attacked them, we didn't win. We then tried to convince them by diplomacy to join us. They were kind of like, you just attacked us, why would you want to do that? So Canada is still independent, they're not part of the United States of America. And we're gonna do it again, in 1812, we're gonna do it again. It doesn't make any sense, but they do it one more time. Maybe they thought first time was just, you know.
Yeah, second time might be a charm.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that happens in this kind of time, well, actually it happens before this, but one of the things that comes out of this is that in order to raise money, what did they do? What did the government do?
Try to sell bonds
And, thought you were going to say something else.
and,
What else did they sell? They printed a whole heck of a lot of money.
Land.
Land, where? What land did they sell? Well, almost right in terms of the territory. Remember I talked the other day about the fact that those colonies,
Yeah, they sold land that actually belonged to the Indians at that time, that they
well,
belonged to the Indians.
nothing belongs to the Indians.
Yeah,
They're not
I
allowed
take
to.
everything.
Um,
But yeah, they sold the land on the.
All those colonies, remember, they thought their charters went from sea to sea. So that at least meant to the Mississippi. So what they did is they gave up some of that land to this new national government. So they ceded their land to the new national government, and the government began to sell it as a way to bring in money. Now, again, it's land where the Indians are living, so we have to win the war to be able to occupy it and get rid of the Indians, but still. So they're selling that land, and it's called the Northwest Territory. So it's mostly north of the Ohio River. It ends up being 5 states: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Michigan, Wisconsin. Those 5 states are going to come out of that territory, but that whole process was done by a guy named Robert Morris, who was kind of like our first treasurer, so to speak, and he sets up this system as a way to bring in revenue. So it's kind of the first way that we began to structure finances in the government under this guy named Morris, and we'll hear more about him under Washington as president. But that's a whole kind of other piece, and one of the significant things about the Northwest Territory, I know I'm losing you because it's like time for you to go, but remember this: the Northwest Territory, the national government abolished slavery there. It's the first time that the national government of America said slavery will not be allowed in this territory. So that kind of goes with what Aaron was saying before. There's this talk that's happening now. People are starting to have this discussion. And it comes through, at least in this Northwest Ordinance, which was in the 1780s, I forget the exact date, I think 1787. So it's going to be the first time that the federal government is going to act to say slavery will not be allowed in a particular territory. And that precedent, we're going to be hearing that a lot from now to the end of the semester.
And if they have to like stop their, like when they started becoming states, and they had to like stop slavery and become a state, right? Something like
In that area,
In that area, like in that time, not right now. Like,
yeah, but in other states, it wasn't true, because in other states, if there had not been that proclamation made about slavery, then they could have slavery.
even to become a state, they could still have slaves.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that quite a bit over the rest of the semester. But that area, no, because any of them who decided to come in as a state, it had already been determined up front that they would have to come in as a slave-free state, but they would not.
That's what I'm saying, yeah, they had to be like slave-free state.
Yeah.
What was the first one? Was it in Vermont or something like that?
They abolished slavery?
Yeah.
You know, I don't even remember.
I think I was
Because several of the states began to do it after the Revolutionary War. They went ahead and said, we're not going to allow slavery. Vermont's definitely one of the earliest ones, I'm not sure. Remember to take your quiz if you haven't already done so on chapter 3 and 4.
Already did,
Oh, I think we should do it before we come to class, you know?
Well, that one's due tonight,
Yeah.
3 and 4.
Oh, I did that.
You already did that one, right? Yeah, you're supposed to, but a couple people had trouble getting into it, so they came in and they thought maybe I hadn't opened it or something, but it just, something wrong with their computer setup.
You know, this book is by far the most I've gotten from anything I've ever read or studied about American history that's pointed at how razor's edge the American Revolution was, how it really could have gone either way at a lot of different points, and how